How's everybody doing? So what I want to talk to you about is some of the challenges that you're going to face with scratch building, most notably plastic deflection, because you're trying to build to scale dimensions like thickness, etc. Like as a steel ship. Like there's no shortage of subjects to build, even for HO scale, believe me. I think HO scale is the ultimate scale for shipbuilding, but then, it depends on the size. I mean, clearly I've only built half of this. I only need half, but this ship would come out to be almost 5 feet long or something. This section that you see right here is, I think it's about 30 inches long. Yeah, which is quite large, actually. And then you get trains on it and everything, but it all scales up beautifully. But one of the things I want to talk to you about that you're going to run into, like it's inevitable, is you're going to run into plastic deflection. Because with evergreen plastic, it's an oil product, right? It's stiff and rigid, but I find evergreen to have a sort of softness to it, which is really nice for modeling. Sanding, takes paint well. It takes paint excellent, actually. But one of the things you're going to face when you scratch build with solvent and plastic, I want to point out, some work in your favor and some don't, but there's always a solution. Let me just roll back here. See the oil canning, which, on the side here, you can see, isn't that neat? That's natural. That's quite common with ships, right? So that occurred when I laid in all the girders on the inside. Okay, now there's probably a lot of plate work there I didn't bother put on, but maybe for the next one, but I just didn't want to do that at this point. But the emphasis of this particular clip is when I get deflection, should I panic? Can I still deal with it? And yes, you can. Let me just point out one thing. See this catwalk here? This was a real challenge because, I want to point out a couple of challenges here because, well, for one is I kept breaking these off. I've already broken off several of these. I've had to re-glue them, and they're just not as straight as they used to be. You can see that it's just not, see the deflection there? Now, there's a solution for this, which I'll talk about in a second. Because what you're going to find that when you build with scale thicknesses, you're going to have to sort of build like the prototype to keep the whole model square. One of the challenges I had was you see this rub rail that I installed here already? Was when I built this hull and this superstructure component, they're both separate. They're separate builds, right? And the challenge was keeping everything okay, so it's on an angle, it's on a little bit of an angle, but this, I knew, had to match the hull almost perfectly. Minus this rub rail. I used this rub rail, which is prototypical, to clean up the edge here. So those are things that you think of. But you can see, I've already glued this side, this is done, but I had to glue it, a couple inches at a time because I never painted, the walkway along there. See down in there, it's still raw plastic, and the bottom of the girders wasn't painted, and there's quarter round in there to add a little bit of beef between the scupper sections. And I had to tape and glue each section just to sort of sew it on, right, with solvent. Now, it's working out pretty good, but you can see that I did that side first, and now I'm doing this side. So what I want to talk to you here for just a few minutes is on filling gaps. Okay, see this gap right here? So let me just give you a little bit of context. So this, everything is glued now except for this side. You can see here I'm chasing it down. This is glued right here. I've glued the starboard side. But when I glued the starboard side last night or whatever, it pulled the superstructure about 1 millimeter. You can see it there. It's flush on the other side and finished, but this wasn't perfect, which is really hard to do when you build two components separately, like the superstructure and the hull. So that is actually really good because I can easily see that. I can push that, and when I go to glue that, I'll have no problem pulling that out to here. And then there's a fairly beefy rub rail that goes along here, So it'll just camouflage that anyway, even if I didn't pull that out, but it will flush up. But I have to do it one sort of scupper spacing at a time. But I want to show you about this gap here. So I did lots of dry runs and there was no gap, but because I glued the other side, you always get a little bit of movement and run out with when you build with plastic or anything for that matter. So you can see here is there's this 1 millimeter gap, right? There was a bit of a gap here on this lower fairing on the port side bow here. I filled that with rod, and I'll show you. So I use rod all the time for filling gaps. Because I'm welding plastic, I don't like to use filler. I rarely ever use filler. In fact, most of my modeling, you know, pilgrimage, I rarely use filler. If I can melt the plastic and create a bead and scrape it and wet sand it, then I'll do that. And the nice thing about boats, when you build ships, steel boats, is you can just turn them into welds anyway. So in this case, it turns out that this is 35 thou, which is about 1 millimeter. Actually, it's 0.88 millimeter, but this will fit in there quite nice like that, see? So what I'll do there is I'll lay this in like this, and then I'll flood this with some fairly fresh cement. Like, remember how I talked to you about that? Like the bottles that you use, like once again, I've pointed this out before, no sponsor, Plastruck, but I use this almost exclusively for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's made for this, and two, it's really low odor, and it's fantastic. I've been using it for, oh, I don't know, almost 20 years now. It's excellent solvent in my experience. So what I'll do is take some, like a fresh bottle of that, really thin. And I like to use rod here because the rod has, like, leaves a trough on each side. Like if you push in a piece of square stock, yeah, it'll be nice and flush. But when you use rod, the solvent capillaries down a trough on each side of the rod. And when you fit it tight, it melts a bit and fills it in beautifully, right? And just in closing here, like this actual sort of, see how this fairing leans in a bit on the superstructure? That's just like the prototype. The prototype is exactly like this. There's this, in fact, if I have a photo handy, I'll just point it out to you. You can see right here, see that? It's rounded here on the superstructure, and you can see the shadow and the line there. And it leans into where this door is. So that's exactly the way it is on the model. But what I'll do is, like I say, is I'll just deal with that with a piece of rod and then weld that, and it'll be nice and good to go. And then just to close on the mounting of the hull, I'll chase these scupper spacings and weld them all the way down and basically get that part done. So it's one basic component now where I can just start doing all the finished details on it, okay? Now it's working out pretty good, but you can see that I did that side first, and now I'm doing this side. And you can see I got this done, but this was quite a challenge because it was inside. I was out about 1 to maybe 1.5, in some cases 2 millimeters, which isn't a lot, but when I went to pull this side out, because this side is all fixed, it was a real challenge. So I had to use like wooden blocks, like my sanding blocks like this basically, and I put one against the girders, which is why you want to have a solid model. And then I would use it to brace, to push the girders from the inside out flush. So I would capillary in cement here, let that cure overnight, and then I did this one. You can see I added a piece of 10 thou, and I'm sort of chasing it all the way down now. You can see where it's out a bit there. Like I haven't put the rub rail on yet. Like the rub rail will fix a lot of that, so there's no need to panic. But this is the kind of thing that you'll run into, and then you'll see here, like this is the last part right here, and you know I have to really pull on that fairly tough, right? Like fairly tight to hold that, which will be no problem, but you can't just glue it all in one go. You have to sort of sew it along, tape it, clamp it, and then because like you say, this is raw plastic, and so is the bottom of this with quarter round to give it a footing to really, bond with. You can see there I had to add a piece too. That's another story, but I don't really go into that. But it turns out that there's a big seam like this on the prototype anyway, so I'm okay with it. So I just left it. Like I have photos to, that actually show that. But you can see the rear of it here too. Like, you see the braces that I put on the inside? That's to keep everything square like this deck. Like this deck has a little bit of a camber on it. Like this lens kind of distorts things more than it should, but there is a slight degree of camber, so the water runs to the scuppers, and there's pipes on the inside here that, kind of run down, etc. But when you build with to scale steel, like you're going to have to factor that in. Like even these braces here that are all partly one panel, I put I-beam in behind them, to keep them straight. So, and then of course these railings are brass, and I'm going to talk about the railings in closing here. So not all the railings are brass here, because I think you can build equally well like these railings here and the ones that are going to be on here, which I'll close with. You can build them equally well out of plastic just by welding them, by just jigging them up. Like they look hard to do, but they're not really. It's just an exercise, right? But I'm really glad I did it like this, because I've kissed this so many times, because you got to handle the model like 1,000 times when you're doing a project that's 3 to 6 months like this. Like you're gonna kiss these, right? And I haven't bent them yet, but I know if they were plastic I would have broke them, like I broke some of these. Like these are sort of bossed out railings, gussets. Now you can see where there's a little bit of deflection there, which is not a problem, because I can see how I can sort of bend it, right? So that'll get all straightened out once I push down the bridge section. Like on the top here, there's another plate that I built in. Like these are things that you just figure out as you go. You can't really teach it. You just have to do it. And when you get deflection in a model, like with this front panel here, like originally it sort of deflected in a bit, but then I was able to push it out from the inside. I built a plate in here that I welded before I closed up, the rear. And then you see these gussets right here. These gussets are actually functional. They're not for show. They get covered up, but they were put here to keep this whole top section square, to build out the deflection, because the plastic wants to pull in. Because when you start to sew parts together, you're going to get tension all over the model. But all you do for that, like don't panic when that happens. You can fix it, okay? You can get in behind, add a gusset, hide it somewhere, push it out. Like learn to do that, and then use that thin solvent to, to push a gusset dry up inside, and then capillary it in. And the solvent kicks off pretty fast. It's not like CA, but it does cure really fast. You can use right angle and quarter round to beef up seams and stuff. Now, let me just mention about these railings in closing here. So these were a real challenge. Like this staircase was a real challenge because of this fairing panel, and it's on a slight gimbaled angle. But to get this straight, and of course there isn't a straight line here, right? It's a ship. Like everything's on an angle. Like there's one straight line here, and the windows, but everything is on an angle, and there's curves everywhere, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like look at the bow, like see the curve, right? Like that can work in your favor too, but you want to make sure you try to keep those symmetrical. But the railings, like to get the railings, because there's all these different angles happening here, and then part of these railings here are built onto this fairing, and then they just disappear in behind, and then sort of start up again up in here. The best way to do those is to just eyeball it. Dry runs and eyeball, tape things in place. If you have to do it 5 times, excuse me, then that's how you solve it. Study your photos, okay? Get as many photos as you can. like I say, once you have a good section of your model built, you can measure off of things, right? And then do sketches too, right? Of parts that you're building. It'll really help you get the ratios right, okay? So don't panic when things deflect, because you can stretch and pull and glue and fix. And when you're building the model, expect that and maybe sort of like watch for that as you're building. And you'll do okay, right? Okay, so look at there, you can see all those girders shining through sort of. And you can see a little bit of the oil canning there. See that? See? Isn't that neat? Anyway, so yeah, so have fun, learn as you go, understand one thing. Build this philosophy into your mind. There are no problems, only solutions, even though you're going to face problems. But just be positive. You can always chase them out and build them out later and fix stuff as you go. Try to paint later. Sometimes you got to paint parts, like this was all painted now first, but this was masked off and I can airbrush this part, but this was all rattle canned. You know, try to think things through. This part in closing has not have any paint on it yet. I masked all this off, this upper catwalk in front of the bridge. Why? Because I want to weld, just like I welded these railings here. Maybe I can just pop this off and show you this in closing. I really like the way this turned out. It took a bit of work, but it actually fits. It actually fits really well. These, like, railings like this are awesome. They're way stronger than you think, right? They really are. And when you use solvent, like the railings weld up really good. Once you get doing railings, you realize how easy that they actually are. So I'm going to do this style up here. But just in closing again, remember, save your railings for last. If you're going to put them in ahead of time like this, make sure they're out of brass because you'll break them. So you got to think that through, right? Those are some of the challenges that you're going to face with scratch building. But you know what? It's all worth it because the reward is awesome, okay? So happy modeling. I hope you have a great day and have fun, okay? Cheers.